In the year of our Lord 1799, on the 21st of December, the darkest night of the year, a tragedy began to unfold in the isolated Yorkshire village of Moorside that would haunt the Dale for generations to come. The Grimshaw farm lay 3 miles from the village proper, a lonely stone building clinging to the bleak moors, perpetually battered by winds that swept down from the northern fells. It was here that Eleanor Grimshaw, wife to the stern and God-fearing farmer Harold Grimshaw, went into labor as a blizzard of unnatural ferocity descended upon the valley. The midwife, an old woman named Agnes Croft who had delivered every child in Moorside for 40 years, was summoned. The journey to the farm was a trial in itself. The snow fell in such thick, relentless sheets that the path was obliterated, and Agnes later swore she was guided by a will other than her own, for she could see no landmarks in the white void. She arrived at the farmhouse half-frozen, her bones aching with a cold that felt ancient and deliberate. The birthing room was a scene of primal terror. Eleanor, a gentle woman worn thin by years of hard labor and isolation, screamed not with the pain of childbirth, but with a profound, spiritual dread. "They are not right, Agnes," she cried out between contractions, her eyes wild with a fear the midwife had never before witnessed in a laboring mother. "I feel 3 souls, but they move as one. They are too quiet in my womb." Harold Grimshaw stood in the corner of the room, his face like granite, clutching a Bible to his chest, his lips moving in silent, frantic prayer. The birth was long and difficult. When the first child emerged, he did not cry. He was a small, pale thing with a shock of jet-black hair and eyes that were too old for a newborn's face. He simply looked about the room with a calm, unsettling awareness. The second and third brothers followed in quick succession, each a perfect mirror image of the first, and each equally, eerily silent. It was only when Agnes, her hands trembling, cleared the mouth of the third babe that a sound was finally heard, not a cry, but a soft, synchronized exhalation from all 3 infants, a sigh that seemed to echo through the room and make the candle flames gutter. It was then that they heard the first crack, a sound like a great bone breaking. From the yard outside came a terrible splintering crash. Harold, rushing to the window with a lantern, saw that the ancient rowan tree that had stood by the farmhouse door for 2 centuries, a tree long said to protect the home from evil influences, had split clean in 2, its heartwood blackened and rotten despite appearing hale just that morning. "The devil's mark is upon them," Harold whispered, his face ashen. He turned his gaze from the ruined tree to the 3 silent infants now swaddled in their mother's arms. Eleanor wept, not tears of joy, but of a bottomless sorrow. She knew, as did they all, that something was terribly wrong. The triplets, named Thomas, William, and Edward for the saints, had entered the world under an omen, and the old protective magic of the land had broken at their arrival. Their silence was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of a storm gathering its strength. That night, as the blizzard raged on, sealing the Grimshaw farm away from the world, a deep and abiding fear took root in the hearts of all who dwelled there, a fear that would only grow with the passing years, fed by the strange, unified silence of the 3 brothers who were, in some fundamental way, not 3, but 1. The grim silence that had marked the triplets' birth persisted throughout their infancy and into their childhood, becoming the defining characteristic of their existence. The Grimshaw farm, already a place of isolation, became a fortress of quiet, its atmosphere so thick with unspoken dread that even the most determined visitors found their spirits dampened and their will to stay sapped within moments of crossing its threshold. The boys, Thomas, William, and Edward, grew at a normal rate, their bodies healthy and strong, yet their development was a profound enigma. They never babbled as infants do. They never cried out for food or comfort. Their needs were communicated through a subtle, unnerving synchronicity of movement that their weary mother, Eleanor, learned to interpret. A simultaneous turning of 3 small heads towards the milk pitcher meant they were hungry. A unified, slow blink of 6 dark eyes signaled sleepiness. It was as if a single consciousness animated their 3 separate forms. Agnes Croft, who visited monthly out of a sense of duty mixed with a macabre fascination, reported to the village women that the silence in the nursery was deafening and that the air within was cold as a tomb, even with a good fire blazing. Their interactions with the world beyond their tight-knit triad were non-existent. When Harold Grimshaw's stern voice would boom through the house, commanding them to some simple chore, the three boys would turn as one, their identical faces blank, their eyes absorbing his presence without a flicker of childish fear or deference. They would then perform the task with an efficiency that was almost mechanical, their movements so perfectly coordinated it was as if they shared a single nervous system. They would stack wood, one-handing logs to the next in a fluid, unbroken chain of motion, never fumbling, never needing to look at one another. They would weed the kitchen garden in a line, their small backs bent in identical postures, their hands moving in unison to pluck the unwanted plants, leaving behind perfectly tended soil. This preternatural coordination was a source of not pride, but deepening horror for their parents. Eleanor, her spirit broken by the constant, oppressive strangeness of her sons, began to fade, becoming a ghost in her own home. She took to wearing a small, silver cross at her throat, her fingers worrying at it constantly. She was heard by a delivery boy from the village, mumbling to herself in the dairy, "They watch me. All three always watching. They know I am not like them." Harold, a man of deep, rigid faith, responded to the fear his sons instilled by doubling the length and fervor of his daily prayers. He filled the house with the smell of beeswax candles and the sound of his own voice reciting scripture, as if he could scour the strange taint from his bloodline with psalms and proverbs. He built a new, larger henhouse, meticulously constructing it in the shape of a cross, hoping its sacred geometry would offer protection. Yet, the livestock remained skittish. The farm dogs, loyal beasts to all others, would not enter the yard when the boys were present, their hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in their throats. The outside world, in the form of the small, tight-knit community of Moorside, viewed the Grimshaw Triplets with a mixture of pity and superstitious terror. The few times Harold was forced to bring them to the village church for a Christmas or Easter service, they became a spectacle that disrupted the entire congregation. Dressed in their matching homespun gray smocks, they would sit perfectly still on the hard wooden pew, their backs straight, their hands folded in their laps. They did not fidget. They did not whisper. They did not react to the hymns or the sermon. They simply stared ahead, their gaze fixed on the crucifix above the altar with an expression that was not one of reverence, but of cool, analytical assessment. The other children would steal terrified glances at them, and more than one mother claimed her babe had begun to wail the moment the three brothers entered the sacred space. Reverend Michael Albright, a man of learning and reason, tried to dismiss the villagers' whispers as ignorant fancy. He paid a pastoral call to the Grimshaw farm one bright Tuesday in the spring of 1808. He was met by Harold at the door, and upon entering the main room, found the three 9-year-old boys seated at the table, a slate and chalk before each of them. They were not writing or drawing. They were simply sitting, waiting. The Reverend attempted to engage them in conversation, asking about their lessons, their prayers, their favorite passages from the Bible. The triplets did not answer. They did not even look at him. Instead, they looked at each other. A silent communication passed between them, a language of infinitesimally small facial twitches and shifts in posture, utterly incomprehensible to the outsider. Then, as one, they turned their heads and looked not at the Reverend, but at a particular knot in the wooden beam above his head. Albright, unnerved, followed their gaze and saw nothing. When he looked back, they were still staring, their dark eyes unwavering. He cut his visit short, and later confided in his journal that he had felt a profound and chilling sense of being assessed, not as a man of God, but as a specimen of some lesser species. By the time the triplets reached their 12th year, the Grimshaw farm was a place shunned. The post rider would leave parcels at the end of the lane. Travelers gave it a wide berth, claiming the very light around the stone house seemed thinner, colder. The boys themselves were rarely seen, and when they were, it was from a distance. Three identical figures moving through the mist that clung to the low pastures, or standing on the crest of a hill, their forms stark against the sky, always together, always silent. The fear they had inspired at their birth had not faded. It had matured, solidifying into a certainty among the people of Moorside that the Grimshaw triplets were not merely strange, but were, in some fundamental way, wrong. A single soul in three bodies, a trinity of silence that nature had never intended, and whose ultimate purpose in God's creation was a terrifying mystery. The year 1815 marked a terrible turning point for the Grimshaw household, a descent from a state of uneasy dread into the heart of tangible tragedy. The harsh Yorkshire winter had been particularly unforgiving, and a fierce influenza swept through the dale, felling the strong and the weak alike. It was this common sickness that took Eleanor Grimshaw, though the circumstances of her passing became the stuff of dark legend in Moorside. For a week, Eleanor lay feverish in the master bedroom, her breathing a ragged, painful sound in the otherwise silent house. Harold, torn between fear of his wife's illness and fear of his son's, maintained a grim vigil by her bedside, his Bible clutched in his work-roughened hands. The triplets, now 16 years old and grown into tall, strikingly handsome young men with those same unsettlingly dark and knowing eyes, behaved with their customary strangeness. They did not approach their mother's sickbed to offer comfort. They did not bring her water or broth. Instead, they took up positions in the corridor outside her room, standing at perfect intervals, their backs against the wall, motionless as sentinels. They would remain there for hours, their presence a silent, oppressive weight that did more to agitate the dying woman than any noise ever could. Agnes Croft, who came daily to tend to Eleanor, later testified that in her final hours, Eleanor had gripped her wrist with a surprising strength, her eyes wide with a terror that transcended the fear of death. "They are waiting, Agnes," she had whispered, her voice a dry rustle. "They are not waiting for me to die. They are waiting for something else. They are listening to the space between my breaths." The midwife, a woman not easily shaken, had felt a chill colder than the winter air seep into her bones. Eleanor Grimshaw passed from this world on a night when the wind stilled to an unnatural hush. Harold, exhausted, had succumbed to sleep in his chair. Agnes had retired to the kitchen for a brief respite. It was in that profound silence that Eleanor breathed her last. And in the moment her breathing ceased, a single, sharp, percussive sound echoed through the house, the sound of 3 hands, simultaneously, striking the wooden door of the sickroom from the outside. When Agnes and Harold rushed in, they found Eleanor gone, her face frozen in an expression of profound relief. But it was what happened next that sealed the family's doom in the eyes of the village. The triplets entered the room. They did not look at their mother's body. They did not approach their grieving father. They moved to the window, where the first light of dawn was staining the sky a bloody red. And as one they smiled. It was not a smile of sorrow, nor of madness. It was a small, cold, satisfied curve of the lips that never reached their eyes. Harold Grimshaw saw that smile, and something in him broke. He fell to his knees, not in prayer, but in utter despair, sobbing great, wrenching sobs that were the only human sound in that terrible room. The funeral was a bleak affair. The triplets stood by the freshly dug grave in the Moorside churchyard, dressed in their matching black, their faces impassive. They showed no grief, no tears, no emotion whatsoever. Their stillness was so absolute, so unnatural amidst the weeping of the few mourners, that Reverend Albright stumbled over his words during the committal. As the clods of earth thudded upon their mother's coffin, the villagers noted that the brothers did not watch it descend into the ground. Their gaze was fixed on their father, who stood trembling and broken, and in their unified stare was a chilling, patient expectation. In the weeks and months that followed Eleanor's death, the last vestiges of normalcy at the Grimshaw farm dissolved. Harold became a recluse, his faith shattered, his mind seemingly crushed by the weight of his loss and the terrifying nature of his sons. He was seen wandering the moors at all hours, muttering to himself, his clothes becoming increasingly ragged. The farm work fell entirely to the triplets, who performed it with their usual inhuman efficiency. The land, however, seemed to sicken alongside its master. Crops failed in fields that had once been fertile. A blight touched the sheep, and several were found dead in the pastures, their bodies unmarked but their flesh spoiled. The brothers, freed from the last softening influence of their mother, grew more bold in their strangeness. They were seen more frequently on the periphery of the farm, though never individually. They began taking long walks across the moors at twilight, their three dark figures moving with a fluid, gliding pace that seemed to cover ground too quickly. A shepherd boy, lost in a sudden fog, claimed to have come upon them standing in a circle around a single, stunted thorn tree, their hands linked, their heads thrown back as if in silent invocation to the gathering dark. He fled in terror and refused to speak of it for days afterward. The house itself seemed to decay from the inside out. Shutters remained closed, and a perpetual gloom settled over the stone building. Strange symbols, crude and angular, were found scratched into the dirt of the yard and on the bark of the few trees that grew near the house. They were not the innocent carvings of youths. They were stark, purposeful, and deeply unsettling. The fear the triplets inspired was no longer just a matter of gossip over garden fences. It became a palpable force that kept every soul in Moorside far from the Grimshaw lane. The brothers had become the lords of their isolated domain, and the air around them crackled with a silent, malevolent energy. The first death had not brought closure, it had opened a door, and through that door, something cold and ancient was slowly creeping into the world. The spring of 1821 arrived late in Yorkshire, the moors clinging to a brittle, lingering cold that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the Grimshaw farm. Harold Grimshaw, once a pillar of stern devotion, had become a spectre of his former self. His wife's death had been the final blow to a spirit long besieged by the unnatural presence of his sons. He was now a man broken, his mind adrift in a sea of grief and terror. The villagers of Moorside, on the rare occasions they caught a glimpse of him, saw a hunched figure shuffling through the village to purchase meager supplies, his eyes darting nervously, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He spoke to no one, and his silence was a louder testament to his torment than any scream could have been. Inside the farmhouse, a dreadful new equilibrium had been established. The triplets, Thomas, William, and Edward, now 22 years of age, were the undisputed masters of the household. They moved through the dark, shuttered rooms with a quiet, proprietary air. Harold was treated not as a father, but as an inconvenient guest, a remnant of a past order that was being systematically erased. They would watch him eat, their 6 eyes fixed on him until he pushed his plate away, his appetite gone. They would stand outside his bedroom door at night, their silent presence a barrier that robbed him of sleep and sanity. The final confrontation, as it was later pieced together from the few, terrified clues Harold left behind, occurred on the night of March 15th. The wind had been howling for days, but on this night, it fell away into an unnerving, breathless calm. Mrs. Darnley, the wife of a farmer whose land bordered the Grimshaws, claimed she was awakened by a sound that was not a sound, a feeling of intense, silent pressure that made her ears pop. Looking from her window towards the Grimshaw farm, she saw no lights, but she had the distinct, chilling impression of figures moving in the yard, their shapes blurred and multiplied in the moonless dark. The next morning, Harold Grimshaw was gone. He had not taken a coat, nor his Bible, the 2 items that had been his constant companions in his decline. His bed had not been slept in. The only evidence of his departure was a single, deep scratch on the inside of the farmhouse's heavy front door, as if fingernails had been dragged down the wood in a final, desperate attempt to hold on. When Harold failed to appear in the village for over a week, a reluctant search party was organized by the constable, a pragmatic man named Briggs who despised the superstition that clung to the Grimshaw name like a foul odor. The search of the farm and the surrounding moors yielded nothing. The triplets were, as ever, uncooperative. They stood together in the yard as the men searched, their arms crossed, their expressions not of concern, but of cold amusement. When Constable Briggs questioned them, they merely stared, offering no answers, their unified silence a wall of contempt. It was young Jem Carter, a farmhand with sharp eyes, who found the only tangible clue. Half buried in the soft peat near the old dry well, the same well that would later claim Thomas, was Harold's waistcoat button. It was not torn loose, but seemed to have been carefully placed there. More disturbing was what was found clutched in the dead grass a few feet away, a small, leather-bound journal. The journal's entries began normally enough, recording weather and crop yields. But as the pages turned, the script deteriorated, becoming a frantic scrawl. The final entries were those of a man teetering on the brink of oblivion. March 10th, They watch me always. 3 faces, 1 mind. They do not sleep. I hear them in the halls, moving as one. They are not my sons. What did we bring into this world? March 12th. They speak without moving their lips. A voice in my head that is not my own. It tells me things. It shows me my death. It is not 1 voice, but 3, woven together. March 14th. They have drawn a circle in the dirt of the cellar. They stand within it and look at me. They are waiting for me to join them. Eleanor, forgive me. I was not strong enough. The final entry, dated March 15th, consisted of only 5 words, the ink blotted and smeared. They are coming for me. The discovery of the journal confirmed the villagers' worst fears. Harold Grimshaw had not simply wandered off and succumbed to the elements. He had been taken by his own children. The nature of that taking was left to the most horrifying imaginations. Had they murdered him and hidden the body where it would never be found? Had they driven him to madness and suicide? Or had something else, something far less comprehensible, occurred? The journal's mention of a voice in my head and the circle in the dirt pointed to forces that the rational constable could not, or would not, acknowledge. With Harold gone, the last barrier between the Grimshaw Triplets and the outside world vanished. They were now utterly alone in their stone house on the moors, 3 brothers bound by a secret that was as deep and dark as the Yorkshire night. The air around Moorside grew heavier still, thick with the unspoken knowledge that a line had been crossed. The first death had been from natural causes, however unnaturally received. The disappearance of Harold was an act of violence, silent and absolute. And as the days lengthened, the village waited with a collective, held breath, knowing with a dreadful certainty that this would not be the end. The unraveling had begun, and it would only end when the last of the Grimshaw blood had been spent. The weeks following Harold Grimshaw's disappearance settled over Moorside like a shroud. The official inquest, led by a coroner from Halifax, concluded with a verdict of presumed death by misadventure or exposure, a bland, bureaucratic phrase that did nothing to quiet the terrors whispering in the village lanes. The Grimshaw Triplets, now the sole inheritors of the farm and its dark legacy, became figures of such potent dread that even the constable avoided the long, winding track that led to their door. The brothers seemed to embrace their complete isolation. They were never seen in the village again. Supplies, a sack of flour, a side of bacon, would be paid for with coins left in a rusty tin pail at the end of their lane, the money always exact, never a farthing more or less. The pail would be emptied under the cover of darkness, and the purchased goods would be gone by morning. It was as if the farm itself was consuming them. The land around the property continued its strange decline. The stone walls that had stood for generations began to list and crumble, not from weather or time, but as if the earth itself was rejecting them. A peculiar, grayish moss, unlike any other in the dale, began to spread across the north face of the farmhouse, its pattern disturbingly uniform, like a scab forming over a wound. The sheep that had been Harold's pride were all gone, sold off or perished, and no new livestock was brought in. The fields lay fallow, choked with weeds that were pale and spindly, as if starved of true sunlight. Yet the triplets were not idle. They were observed from a great distance by shepherds on the high fells, engaged in strange, repetitive labors. They spent days building a series of low, concentric stone circles in the pasture furthest from the house. The work was done with their characteristic, unnerving synchronicity, one brother placing a stone while the other 2 stood watch, their heads turning in unison to scan the horizon. They built no walls for shelter, no pens for animals. The purpose of the circles was inscrutable, a silent geometry that spoke of a reasoning far removed from the practical concerns of farming. At night, a different kind of activity was suspected. Lights were seen moving in the woods that crowned the moor behind the farm, not the steady glow of a lantern, but fleeting, will-o'-the-wisp flickers that danced between the trees. A traveling tinker, caught out by darkness and foolishly camping too near the Grimshaw land, fled at first light, white-faced and babbling about voices from the stones, and 3 shadows that walked as one, but cast none. He left his cart behind and was never seen in Yorkshire again. The atmosphere in Moorside became thick with a superstitious panic. Reverend Albright, his rationalism worn thin by the relentless strangeness, preached sermons on the dangers of unholy communion and pacts made in silence, his eyes continually darting towards the church door as if expecting the three brothers to enter. Parents forbade their children from playing on the moors, and old folk made the sign of the cross when a crow, a bird that now seemed to gather in unusual numbers around the Grimshaw farm, flew overhead. The brothers themselves seemed to be undergoing a subtle transformation. On the rare occasions they were glimpsed, they appeared gaunter, their handsome features sharpened, their movements even more fluid and predatory. They were like creatures adapting to a new and harsher environment, shedding the last vestiges of their humanity. Their silence was no longer just an absence of speech, it had become a physical force, a void that seemed to draw all sound and warmth into itself. The village was caught in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the next tragedy to strike. They did not have to wait long. The strange stone circles were completed under the pale light of a gibbous moon. The following evening, a blood-red sunset painted the western sky, and the wind died away to utter stillness. In the deep of that night, a single, piercing scream tore through the silence of the moors. It was a sound of such pure, unadulterated terror that it woke every soul in Moorside. It came from the direction of the Grimshaw farm, and it was cut off with a suddenness that was more frightening than the scream itself. The next morning, the first of the brothers, Thomas, was found dead. The nature of his death was so bizarre, so contrary to all natural law, that the horror which had long festered in the shadows of Moorside finally erupted into the full light of day, and the true, terrifying nature of the Grimshaw curse began to reveal itself. The scream that shattered the night was a sound the villagers of Moorside would carry to their graves. It was not a cry for help, nor a shout of pain, but a raw, sustained note of existential terror that seemed to claw at the very fabric of reality. It echoed across the silent moors for what felt like an eternity before being severed with an abruptness that left the night colder and darker than before. At first light, a grim-faced party assembled outside the constable's office. Led by Constable Briggs and Reverend Albright, they were a motley collection of farmers and tradesmen, their courage fortified by daylight and the strength of numbers. None spoke as they marched up the lane to the Grimshaw farm, their boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The air was preternaturally still, and the farmhouse ahead seemed to watch their approach with a malevolent consciousness. They found the front door ajar. Pushing it open, they were met by a chilling scene. William and Edward Grimshaw were seated at the heavy oak table in the main room. They were not eating. They were not reading. They were simply sitting, facing the door, as if they had been waiting. Their faces were calm, devoid of any emotion, their hands resting flat on the table before them. They showed no surprise at the arrival of the party. They merely watched. "Where is your brother?" Constable Briggs demanded, his voice louder than intended, cracking the oppressive silence. The brothers did not answer. Instead, as one, they turned their heads and looked towards the back door of the house, which led out to the yard and the old well. The well. It was a structure everyone knew. A dry, stone-lined shaft, some 20 feet deep, that had been useless for generations. Its wooden cover was usually in place, secured by a heavy stone. Now, the cover was gone, cast aside and splintered as if by a great force. The men approached the well with a mounting dread. A foul odor wafted from its depths, not the damp smell of earth, but a metallic, coppery scent that stuck in the back of the throat. Constable Briggs, his heart hammering against his ribs, leaned cautiously over the crumbling stone lip and looked down. The body of Thomas Grimshaw lay at the bottom. But it was not the sight of his corpse that caused the constable to recoil with a strangled cry and cross himself, a gesture he had not made since childhood. It was the position of the body. Thomas was contorted into a shape that defied human anatomy. His limbs were bent at impossible angles, his spine twisted into a spiral that should have snapped bone. His head was craned back so far that his face, pale and serene in the gloom, was looking straight up at the circle of sky above, his dark eyes wide open. One arm was stretched upwards, the fingers splayed as if reaching for a salvation that had been cruelly withheld. It was a pose of such profound, unnatural torsion that it spoke not of a fall, but of a body that had been wrung like a rag. How in God's name? One of the farmers stammered, backing away from the well, his face green with nausea. The well was only 20 feet deep. A fall, even onto hard-packed earth, might break bones, but it could not twist a man into a human knot. There was not enough space, not enough force. It was as if some immense, invisible hand had reached into the well and methodically rearranged him in that horrific tableau. Reverend Albright began to pray, his voice a tremulous whisper that was swallowed by the oppressive silence. The other men stood frozen, their courage evaporating in the face of this violation of natural law. Then a sound came from the house. A soft, rhythmic scraping. All eyes turned to the back door. William and Edward had risen from the table and were now standing in the doorway, watching the scene at the well. In William's hand was a woodworking plane. In Edward's, a chisel. They were not looking at the men. They were looking at their brother's body in the well. And as they watched, William slowly, deliberately, drew the plane across a piece of wood he held, the sound a dry whisper against the stunned silence. Edward mirrored the motion with his chisel. They were working. As their brother's impossibly mangled body lay at the bottom of a well barely deep enough to stand in, the two remaining Grimshaw triplets were calmly engaged in carpentry. There was no grief, no shock, only a cold, focused detachment that was more terrifying than any display of madness. The men fled. They left the Grimshaw farm at a run, not stopping until they reached the village. The official report would later state that Thomas Grimshaw had died from a fall, his body badly broken. But every man who had been there that day knew the truth was infinitely worse. Thomas had not merely died. He had been unmade. And his brothers, the silent, watching brothers, had not only expected it, they had accepted it as part of some dreadful, incomprehensible design. The horror was no longer just about death. It was about the rules of the world itself breaking down, starting at the Grimshaw farm. The discovery of Thomas Grimshaw's body marked a watershed moment for Moorside. The village's long-nurtured dread now blossomed into full-blown, paralyzing terror. The official verdict of accidental death was a thin parchment laid over a gaping chasm of horror, and no one was fooled. The constable's party had returned as changed men, haunted, pale, and unwilling to speak of what they had seen beyond muttered references to the well and the silence. The Grimshaw farm was now universally acknowledged as a place of active, malevolent evil. It was quarantined by fear, its boundaries respected as though marked by plague signs. In the weeks that followed Thomas's burial in a remote corner of the churchyard, a service conducted with frantic haste and no family in attendance, the activities of the two remaining brothers, William and Edward, seemed to intensify. The strange, concentric stone circles they had built in the upper pasture became the focal point of their existence. From a distance, through a spyglass borrowed from a retired sea captain, Reverend Albright observed them with growing despair. The brothers did not farm, nor tend to the crumbling property. Their entire being was dedicated to these silent structures. They would walk the circles for hours, their steps perfectly synchronized, their heads bowed as if in prayer or measurement. They would pause at certain points, placing their hands upon specific stones, sometimes for minutes at a time, utterly motionless. At other times, they would make minute adjustments, shifting a rock a hand's breadth to the left, turning another to expose a different face. It was a form of meticulous, obsessive maintenance that served no apparent purpose, a ritual whose meaning was locked away in their shared, impenetrable consciousness. The weather around the farm grew increasingly erratic. While the rest of the dale enjoyed a mild spring, a perpetual, chill mist clung to the Grimshaw land, and strange, localized winds would whip across the pasture, stirring the dead grasses in patterns that seemed to mimic the stone circles. The crows that had gathered there now numbered in the hundreds, a black, cawing congregation that wheeled overhead but never landed within the circles themselves. A new, more disturbing detail emerged. The brothers had begun to bring objects from the house into the circles. Through the spyglass, the reverend saw them arranging household items with ceremonial care. A pewter jug at the center of the innermost ring, a tarnished silver brush at the next, a worn leather Bible, surely their father's, placed face down at a third point. They were not desecrating these items. They were positioning them with a precision that suggested they were components in a vast, silent mechanism. The psychological toll on Moorside was immense. The village became a place of locked doors and hushed voices. The cheerful sounds of children playing were silenced by dusk. Sleep was fractured by nightmares. People reported hearing whispers on the wind, not of words, but of numbers, of angles, of a cold, mathematical language that grated on the soul. A pervasive sense of being watched from the moors settled over everyone. The Grimshaw twins, though unseen, were a constant, oppressive presence. Reverend Albright, his faith straining against this tide of unnaturalness, attempted one final intervention. He could not muster another search party. No man in the village would set foot on the property again. Instead, he went alone. It was a fool's errand, he knew, but his duty as a shepherd of souls demanded it. He carried no Bible, no cross, feeling such symbols would be useless against the geometric silence that now ruled the farm. He found William and Edward at the stone circles. They did not acknowledge his approach. They were on their knees, their fingers tracing the joins between the stones, their lips moving in a silent, synchronized rhythm. Up close, the Reverend felt a physical pressure, a disorientation that made the ground seem to tilt beneath his feet. The air was dead, devoid of the scent of earth or heather, tasting only of dust and stone. "William! Edward!" he called out, his voice swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. "In the name of God, and of the humanity that is your birthright, I implore you. Stop this. What are you doing?" The brothers ceased their tracing. They rose to their feet and turned to face him. Their eyes, those identical pools of ancient darkness, held no recognition, no hostility, no emotion of any kind. They looked at him as a mathematician might look at an irrelevant variable. It was Edward who moved. He walked not towards the Reverend, but to the perimeter of the outermost circle. He stopped at a specific stone, smaller and darker than the others. He pointed at it, then slowly, deliberately, he pointed at Reverend Albright. The meaning was as clear as it was chilling. "You are outside the pattern. You do not belong here." A wave of pure, intellectual terror washed over the Reverend. This was not the fear of a monster, but the fear of being utterly irrelevant to a process so vast and alien that his own soul was of no more consequence than a speck of dust. He stumbled back, his courage shattered, and fled the farm without another word. He returned to the village a broken man. He took to his bed and spoke little thereafter, his eyes forever holding the distant, horrified look of one who has seen the universe not as a creation of love, but as a cold, equations. The last bridge of understanding between Moorside and the Grimshaw twins had been burned. There was no more hope of redemption, no more possibility of communication. William and Edward were no longer just frightening. They were architects of a reality that had no place for humanity. And everyone in Moorside knew, with a certainty that froze the blood, that the geometry of the stones was nearing completion. The pattern demanded another sacrifice to fulfill its silent, terrible logic. The stage was set for the next act in the tragedy, and the whole village waited, prisoners in their own homes, for the second scream they knew must come. The scream, when it came, was different from the first. It was not a single, piercing note of terror, but a series of shorter, sharper cries that seemed to struggle against being silenced, each one cut off more abruptly than the last. It echoed from the direction of the Grimshaw farm on a night when a thick, soupy fog had rolled in from the moors, muffling all sound and reducing the world to a few feet of visibility. Those who heard it in Moorside did not venture out. They simply locked their doors, bolted their shutters, and prayed, knowing that whatever was happening up at the old farm was beyond any mortal power to stop. The following morning, the fog persisted, clinging to the land with a cold, damp tenacity. It was the blacksmith's son, a bold youth of 16 sent on an herder to the far side of the dale, who made the discovery. Taking a shortcut that passed within sight of the Grimshaw property, he saw something through the shifting mist that made his blood run cold. The large, high doors of the main barn, which had always been kept closed, were swung wide open. And from the central beam, just inside the threshold, a dark shape hung suspended. Terrified but compelled by a gruesome curiosity, the boy crept closer. The shape resolved into the figure of William Grimshaw. He was hanging by a rope from the great oak beam that spanned the barn's interior. His body swayed almost imperceptibly in the damp air. The boy fled, his screams finally rousing the village to action. Constable Briggs, his face a mask of grim resignation, assembled another reluctant party. The journey to the farm was a silent, funereal procession through the fog. They found the scene exactly as the boy had described. William Grimshaw was dead, hanged by the neck. But as with Thomas's death, the reality of the situation defied all natural explanation. The beam from which he hung was a full 20 feet from the hard-packed earth floor of the barn. There was no ladder, no stool, no stack of hay bales, nothing whatsoever that could have served as a platform from which to jump. The rope itself was a coarse, hempen thing, but its origin was a mystery. There was no such rope in any of the farm's outbuildings, and it was of a type not commonly used in the dale. It was as if it had simply materialized for this single, dreadful purpose. Most chilling of all was the expression on William's face. It was not the bloated, suffused visage of a hanged man. His features were calm, almost serene, his eyes closed as if in sleep. There were no signs of a struggle in the dust of the barn floor, no scuff marks or kicked-over tools. It was a scene of perfect, impossible stillness. He had not fought his death. He had accepted it, or perhaps even welcomed it as part of the dreadful pattern he and his brothers were weaving. And where was Edward during this? He was found not in the barn, nor hiding in the house. He was in the pasture, standing within the innermost of the stone circles. He was perfectly still, his back to the farm, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. He did not turn as the men arrived, did not react to their shouts. He was facing the great, blank wall of fog that shrouded the moors, as if awaiting an audience with something hidden within it. When Constable Briggs approached him, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sheer, undiluted fear, Edward slowly turned his head. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if he were looking through the constable at something far away. "Your brother is dead," Briggs shouted, gesturing wildly towards the barn. "What devilry is this? What have you done?" Edward's lips moved, forming a single, silent word. Though no sound emerged, the men watching were later unanimous in their interpretation. The word was yes. It was not an admission of guilt. It was an affirmation, a confirmation that events were proceeding as they should. The men cut down William's body, their hands shaking so badly they could barely work. They laid him on a rough stretcher and prepared to carry him back to the village. As they departed, they cast one last, terrified look back at Edward. He had not moved. He had returned to his vigil, a solitary sentinel in his circle of stones, a living man who seemed already to have joined his brothers in whatever silent, terrible realm they now inhabited. The second death cemented the Grimshaw farm's status as a place of absolute damnation. The horror was no longer just in the deaths themselves, but in their impossible mechanics and the chilling acceptance with which they were met. The brothers were not victims of an external force. They were willing participants in their own destruction, actors in a play whose script only they could read. And with William's body laid out in the church crypt next to Thomas's, the people of Moorside knew, with a sickening certainty, that the pattern was not yet complete. There was one brother left. The circles in the pasture were still there. The silence remained. And Edward Grimshaw, the last of the triplets, was still waiting for his cue. The death of William Grimshaw left Edward as the sole inhabitant of the farm, a lone figure moving through the decaying shell of his family's legacy. The village of Moorside, now gripped by a terror so profound it had become a kind of numb acceptance, watched from a distance. No one ventured near. The lane leading to the farm became overgrown, as if nature itself was trying to erase the path to that accursed place. Yet, despite the isolation, Edward's presence was felt more strongly than ever. He was the engine of the silence now, its source and its keeper. His existence became entirely dedicated to the stone circles. He was observed through spyglasses from the high fells, a dark, gaunt figure moving with a purpose that was both ritualistic and desperate. He no longer entered the farmhouse, it seemed, but slept within the innermost circle, curled on the bare earth like a wild animal. He spent his days walking the concentric rings, his lips moving in that constant, silent litany. He would pause to touch certain stones with an almost loving reverence, while others he would strike with a smaller rock, creating a sharp, percussive click that echoed faintly across the moors, a metronome marking a countdown to an unknown end. The land around him continued to sicken. The gray moss spread from the house to the outbuildings, and then began to creep across the pasture itself, a blight that killed the grass and left the soil hard and brittle. The crows multiplied, their numbers now a swirling, cacophonous cloud that darkened the sky above the farm. They were no longer silent. Their cawing became a constant, ragged chorus that sounded unnervingly like distorted human speech. Some villagers swore they could hear their own names called out from the cacophony. A new and even more disturbing phenomenon began. On still nights, a low, resonant hum could be heard emanating from the direction of the farm. It was not the wind, nor any known insect or animal. It was a deep, vibrational thrum that seemed to come up from the very bedrock, a sound that set teeth on edge and vibrated in the bones of those who heard it. It was the sound of the stones themselves, singing a song of ancient, alien power. Reverend Albright, though broken in spirit, documented everything in his journal, his script becoming as frantic and uneven as Harold Grimshaw's had been. He wrote of dreams filled with geometric shapes that shifted and reformed into screaming faces. He theorized, in his despair, that the triplets were not human at all, but something else, fragments of an older intelligence that had been mistakenly born into human flesh and were now, through their silent rituals, trying to reassemble themselves or open a doorway back to their own realm. Their deaths were not suicides, but transformations, each one a necessary step in a grand and terrifying equation. Weeks turned into a month. Edward grew thinner, his movements slower, yet his dedication never wavered. He began to make changes to the circles. He started dismantling sections of the outer rings, using the stones to reinforce the inner ones. It was as if he was focusing the energy, concentrating the pattern, funneling it all towards the center where he now spent nearly all his time. He was building a prison for himself, an altar upon which he would be the final offering. The weather grew increasingly unstable. The strange, localized winds around the farm intensified, whipping the crows into frenzies and tearing loose stones from the crumbling walls. Peculiar lights were seen dancing within the circles at night, not the warm glow of a fire, but cold, phosphorescent glimmers of green and violet that pulsed in time with the humming from the earth. The very air began to smell of ozone and hot metal, the scent of a coming storm that had nothing to do with rain. The people of Moorside knew the end was near. The pattern was reaching its climax. The dreadful symmetry that had governed the triplets' lives, 3 brothers, 3 identical forms, 3 terrible deaths, demanded a final, closing note. Edward, the last component, was preparing to complete the circuit. He was no longer a man, but an instrument being tuned for a final, catastrophic chord. The village held its breath, waiting for the last act of the Grimshaw tragedy, knowing that whatever happened when the pattern was complete would be worse than anything that had come before. They were not just waiting for a death, they were waiting for a rupture. The air in Moorside grew thick with a palpable tension, a static charge that raised the hairs on the back of every neck. The unnatural hum emanating from the Grimshaw farm was no longer a distant nuisance. It had become a constant, oppressive presence, a vibration that could be felt through the soles of one's boots, a pressure that made ears pop and heads ache. It was the sound of the world straining at its seams. The crows had fallen silent, a development more terrifying than their previous cacophony. They now sat in rigid, orderly rows upon the stone walls and the roof of the farmhouse, thousands of them, a feathered army watching the pasture with black, glittering eyes. Edward Grimshaw was scarcely recognizable as human. He was an emaciated specter, his clothes hanging in tatters from his frame, his skin stretched tight over bone. He moved within the stone circles with a jerky, marionette-like grace, his actions no longer those of ritual maintenance, but of frantic, final preparation. He had completed the dismantling of the outer rings, and all the stones now formed a dense, complex spiral focused on a single, flat, altar-like rock at the very center. From a distance, through the shimmering, distorted air, It looked less like a stone circle and more like a vortex, a whirlpool carved into the earth. The phenomena surrounding the farm escalated from unsettling to reality-shattering. On the evening of July 14th, the shopkeeper's wife, looking out her window, swore she saw two figures standing beside Edward in the circle, two tall, dark-haired young men. She called for her husband, but by the time he looked, there was only Edward. A shepherd, guarding his flock on the high moor, reported that for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the entire Grimshaw farm had flickered, as if it were a picture on a sheet being shaken, and in that instant, he saw not a decaying farm, but a towering, obsidian structure of impossible angles, piercing a sickly green sky. Reverend Albright, in his final journal entry, scrawled a single, desperate sentence: "God has turned his face away from this place. The geometry is not of his making." The climax came on the night of July 15th. There was no storm, no wind. The air was perfectly still and cold, the stars blotted out by a darkness that felt solid, suffocating. Then the humming stopped. The sudden silence was more deafening than the noise had been. In every house in Moorside, people stood frozen, waiting. A light bloomed in the pasture, a cold, actinic blue that did not illuminate but rather consumed the darkness around it. It pulsed from the center of the stone spiral, throwing the standing stones into stark, skeletal relief. From this distance, they saw Edward's figure, a black silhouette against the terrible blue heart of the light. He raised his arms. And then the world tore. It was not a sound, but a sensation of ripping, of a great, silent scream from the universe itself. The blue light flared, swallowing Edward whole. For a single, eternal second, it expanded, and the villagers saw, or thought they saw, shapes moving within it. Three figures, now joined, now one, dissolving into the light, and for a moment, a vast, unblinking eye of pure mathematics regarding them with cold, infinite indifference. Then it was over. The light vanished. The silence returned, deeper and more absolute than ever before. The oppressive pressure was gone. The crows, as one, took to the air in a thunderous beat of wings and scattered to the four winds, never to return in such numbers. When dawn broke, pale and tentative, a party of the bravest, or most foolish, men, including a hollow-eyed Constable Briggs, made the journey to the Grimshaw farm. They found the pastures scarred but empty. The intricate stone spiral was gone. Every single stone had been vaporized, leaving behind only a shallow, glass-smooth depression in the earth, fused to a vitrified finish. Of Edward Grimshaw, there was no trace. No ash, no bone, no fragment of cloth. He had been utterly and completely unmade, erased from existence. The farmhouse and outbuildings stood silent, already looking like ruins from a bygone age. The investigation that followed was perfunctory. The official record would state that Edward Grimshaw had disappeared, presumed dead, likely a victim of a bizarre and localized geological event, a gas explosion perhaps. But the people of Moorside knew the truth. The Grimshaw Triplets were gone. Their dreadful work was finished. The pattern was complete. They had not simply died. They had achieved something, transcended their physical forms through a series of impossible deaths to become part of something else, something that had looked back at them from that blue light with the triplets' own cold, knowing eyes. The horror did not leave with them. It had seeped into the land, into the very memory of the place. The scar in the pasture never grassed over. It remained a bald, vitrified patch, a permanent wound on the face of the moor. And on certain quiet nights, when the wind is just right, the people of Moorside still claim to hear it, not a hum, not a scream, but the faint, chilling, and perfectly synchronized sound of three brothers, walking together through the heather, their footsteps silent, their presence a cold geometry in the dark. The immediate aftermath of Edward Grimshaw's disappearance brought no relief to Moorside, only a different, more profound species of dread. The silence that returned to the dale was not the peaceful quiet of the countryside. It was the hush that follows an explosion, a void where something monstrous had once been. The physical evidence of that final night was both undeniable and inexplicable. The vitrified patch of earth where the stone circles had been became known as the Grimshaw Scar, a bald, glassy depression that repelled all life. No weed, no blade of grass, no insect ever crawled across its smooth, unnatural surface. It was a hole in the natural world, a place where reality had been burned away and replaced with something sterile and alien. The farm itself was left to the elements. No one would purchase the land, nor would anyone venture there to salvage stone or timber. It was as if the property had been spiritually quarantined. The buildings decayed with unnerving speed, the wood rotting away to dust, the stone walls crumbling not from random weather, but as if they were dissolving from the memory of what had transpired within them. Within a decade, the main house was a skeletal ruin, and within two, it was little more than a foundation being slowly swallowed by the stubborn moorland heather. Yet, the legacy of the triplets was not so easily erased. The stories, now hardened into local dogma, were passed down through generations. They were no longer whispered fears, but cautionary tales told to children to keep them from wandering onto the moors after dark. The names Thomas, William, and Edward Grimshaw became synonymous with the unnatural, a trinity of warning. The specific details of their deaths, the impossible contortion in the well, the unexplained hanging in the barn, the final erasure at the stone circles, became a folkloric cycle, a dark mythos that explained the strange, cold feeling that clung to that particular part of the dale. The phenomenon of the synchronized footsteps was the most persistent and chilling remnant. It was never a common occurrence, but over the years, dozens of otherwise reliable individuals, shepherds, poachers, a lost hiker in a later century, would report the same experience. Alone on the moors near the old Grimshaw land, usually in the twilight hours or under a full moon, they would hear it, the clear, distinct sound of three people walking in perfect step. The sound would approach, sometimes from behind, sometimes from the side, the crunch of heather underfoot in a rhythm so precise it could only be military or supernatural. But when they turned, there was never anyone there. The sound would simply stop, or sometimes, it would pass right by them, the unseen walkers close enough to feel a sudden drop in temperature, a gust of cold air that smelled of dust and stone. Those who experienced it were never the same. They spoke of a feeling of being assessed, of being irrelevant to the journey of these unseen entities, much as Reverend Albright had felt all those years ago. Nearly 50 years after the final disappearance, in 1871, the Grimshaw legend attracted a different kind of attention. Professor Sir Edmund Wolsey, a noted anthropologist and folklorist from London, arrived in Moorside. He was a man of the new age of science and reason, armed with a skepticism as sharp as his intellect. He had read the scattered, sensationalized accounts in regional newspapers and heard the whispers in academic circles about the Yorkshire Triplets phenomenon. He came not to validate the superstitions, but to debunk them, to explain the events through rational means. Mass hysteria, geological oddities, perhaps a family history of shared psychosis. He rented a room in the village and began his investigation with brisk efficiency. He interviewed the elderly who had been children at the time of the events. He pored over the parish records, noting the stark entries of birth and death. He examined the official, woefully inadequate constabulary reports. He even took measurements and sketches of the Grimshaw scar, dismissing the villagers' claims of its unnatural origins as the result of a lightning strike or a small, contained peat fire that had baked the soil into a ceramic-like state. The people of Moorside, their memories long and their trust in outsiders short, regarded him with wary amusement. They answered his questions with polite, non-committal answers, withholding the deeper, more chilling details they reserved for themselves. They watched as he strode confidently up the lane to the ruins, his bag full of instruments, and they waited for the moor to teach him the lesson they all knew was coming. Professor Wolsey was a rationalist, but he was not a fool. As he stood in the midst of the ruins, the silence of the place began to weigh upon him differently than the simple quiet of an abandoned farm. It was an active silence, a listening presence. The air was still and cold, though the sun shone brightly elsewhere. His compass needle, he noted with professional interest and personal unease, wavered erratically when he held it over the Grimshaw scar, refusing to settle on true north. He dismissed it as a local magnetic anomaly, perhaps a vein of iron ore. His skepticism received its first true blow that evening. Deciding to experience the location at twilight, the time most associated with the legendary footsteps, he remained at the ruins as the sun dipped below the hills. He was taking notes on the quality of the light when he heard it. Not from one direction, but from three, converging upon him. A crisp, rhythmic crunch of footsteps on heather, moving in perfect military lockstep. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. There was nothing. The sounds continued, now forming a circle around him, closing in. The temperature plummeted. The rational explanations, trick of the wind, the sound of his own pulse in his ears, evaporated in the face of the tangible, intelligent presence he felt encircling him. It was assessing him, this man of science, and finding him wanting. He felt a cold, profound indifference that was more terrifying than any malevolence. With a cry that was half fear, half outrage at the violation of his worldview, Sir Edmund Wolsey fled, leaving his expensive theodolite behind in the heather. He left Moorside the next morning, much earlier than planned. His subsequent publication, a study in collective delusion, the Grimshaw case of North Yorkshire, was a masterwork of academic evasion, attributing the events to shared psychosis and unusual geological phenomena. But those who knew him said he was a changed man afterwards. He never again ventured into the field, and he was known to startle at sudden, rhythmic noises. The moors of Yorkshire had shown him a crack in the edifice of his rational universe, and he had peered through it, seen the cold geometry moving in the void beyond, and had never been able to forget it. The Grimshaw curse had claimed another victim, not through death, but through the utter demolition of his understanding of the world. The 20th century dawned, but time seemed to flow differently around Moorside. The world beyond the dale transformed at a dizzying pace. Automobiles replaced horses, electric light banished the deep shadows of coal oil lamps, and the wireless brought voices from across the globe into humble parlors. Yet, in Moorside, the old fear remained, a bedrock of dread beneath a thin veneer of modernity. The Grimshaw story was no longer a thing of active terror for the younger generations, but rather a foundational myth, a local curiosity to be shared with slightly condescending amusement with visitors from the city. The ruins of the farm were a destination for dares among teenagers, and the Grimshaw scar was a geological oddity pointed out to hikers. But the land had not forgotten. The silence that had once been a palpable force had now settled deep into the soil and stone, becoming a permanent, low-frequency hum in the soul of the place. It was a silence that could be felt rather than heard, a subtle pressure that made birds skirt a wide berth around the old property and caused dogs to whimper and pull at their leads when walked too near the overgrown lane. Those who were sensitive to such things, the old families who had lived in the dale for centuries, still felt it. They knew that the absence of the triplets did not mean an absence of their influence. The pattern they had woven with their lives and deaths was still there, etched into the very fabric of the location, a dormant circuit waiting for a power source. The synchronized footsteps were still reported, though less frequently, often dismissed as the wind playing tricks in the ruined foundations or the echo of a walker's own steps. But those who heard it knew the difference. They knew the uncanny precision of that rhythm, the way it seemed to disregard the terrain, moving with the same measured pace over bog and solid ground alike. The land itself seemed to be healing in a strange, alien way. The Grimshaw scar remained barren, but around its edges, a new type of heather had begun to grow. It was a darker, almost blackish purple, and its flowers, when they bloomed, had a faint, phosphorescent quality in the moonlight. Botanists from the university in Leeds came to study it once, declaring it a rare but natural subspecies. The villagers knew better. They called it Grimshaw's shroud, and they left it strictly alone. It was as if the land, having been scarred by an unnatural force, could now only produce a life that was itself touched by the unnatural. The old records, Reverend Albright's journal, the constable's reports, the few terrified entries from Harold Grimshaw, were stored in a dusty box in the back of the village church. They were seldom looked at, their crumbling pages holding a horror that felt both distant and uncomfortably close. The story had been codified, sanitized by retelling. The raw, visceral terror felt by those who had witnessed the events had been smoothed into the pleasing shapes of folklore. Yet, on certain nights, when the moon was full and the wind was still, the older residents would draw their curtains tight and stoke their fires. for it was on such nights that the silence felt heaviest, most watchful. It was on such nights that the feeling of being observed from the moors was strongest, not by anything malevolent, but by something vast, patient, and utterly indifferent. A consciousness that had been born from the fusion of three human minds into something else, something that had become a permanent feature of the landscape, as inherent to the place as the granite in the hills and the peat in the soil. The horror of the Grimshaw Triplets was no longer an event, it was a state of being. The tragedy was over, but the silence they had cultivated now ruled supreme, a king over its empty domain. The post-war years of the 1950s brought a new kind of invader to the quiet dale, progress. A Manchester property developer, Charles Wainwright, saw in the moors around Moorside not a place of ancient silence and deep-rooted dread, but a potential for profit. He envisioned a model village, a quaint estate of holiday cottages for city folk seeking rustic tranquility. With a keen eye for a bargain, he acquired vast tracts of land, including, for a pittance from a disinterested distant relative, the old Grimshaw farm. The villagers watched this development with a mixture of disdain and grim satisfaction. They whispered in the pub, warning that no good would come of building on that land. But Wainwright was a man of concrete and steel, of architectural plans and balance sheets. He dismissed their superstitions as the backward mutterings of yokels. To him, the Grimshaw ruins were an eyesore, and the strange, glassy scar in the pasture was a curiosity to be landscaped into a feature. His crew, hard-nosed men from Liverpool and Glasgow, moved in with bulldozers and dynamite. They laughed at the local stories, their bravado fueled by stout ale and good wages. The first task was to clear the ruins of the Grimshaw farmhouse. It was then that the trouble began. The bulldozer meant to push over the last standing wall of the house simply stalled, its engine dying despite a full tank and a clean bill of health from the mechanic. When it was restarted, it wouldn't move towards the wall, its tracks locking as if meeting an invisible, immovable force. The driver, a skeptic named O'Malley, swore and tried to reverse. The machine moved backwards without issue. Annoyed, Wainwright ordered the wall to be taken down by hand. The workmen, wielding sledgehammers, found the ancient stone unnaturally resilient. Their blows seemed to be absorbed, the sound a dull, dead thud. Worse, two men were struck by flying chips of stone that seemed to veer unnaturally from their strikes, cutting their hands and faces with malicious precision. A general unease began to settle over the crew. The following day, they began work on the foundations for the first holiday cottage, chosen to be built on the very spot where the main farmhouse had stood. The ground, which should have been soft peat and soil, was as hard as iron. Their mechanical diggers bucked and strained, their teeth screeching against the unyielding earth. When they finally resorted to dynamite, the resulting explosion was strangely muffled, the shock wave absorbed by the ground. The crater it left was shallow, and at its bottom, the men found not bedrock, but a tangled, petrified mass of roots, black as jet and cold to the touch, that seemed to writhe and twist in the periphery of their vision. No one would touch them. The final straw came when they attempted to address the Grimshaw scar. Wainwright, determined to erase this blemish, ordered a team to break it up with jackhammers. The first strike of the pneumatic tool produced not a crack, but a low, resonant hum that vibrated up through the men's bones and set their teeth on edge. With the second strike, the hum intensified into a shriek that seemed to come from the air itself. The glassy surface of the scar remained unmarked, but every pane of glass in the construction site's trailers and vehicles shattered simultaneously. Then, as the men stood frozen in terror, they heard it, the crisp, synchronized crunch of footsteps on gravel, circling them. They saw nothing, but the sound was unmistakable, moving with a predatory slowness around the perimeter of their work site. The crew downed tools and refused to return. They packed their belongings and left that very afternoon, forfeiting their pay. O'Malley, the bulldozer driver, was heard muttering about 3 dark lads he'd seen standing at the edge of the treeline, watching them with cold, expressionless faces. Charles Wainwright, faced with mutiny and escalating unexplainable costs, was forced to abandon the project. The bank foreclosed on the land, and it was sold back to the county for a fraction of what he paid. The half-laid foundations and the abandoned construction materials were left to rust and be reclaimed by the heather. The venture, which the locals had cynically dubbed Wainwright's Folly, became a modern addition to the Grimshaw legend. It was proof that the silence of the place was not passive. It was a guardian, and it would not be displaced by mere dynamite and ambition. The land had defended itself, and the triplets, or what they had become, had once again asserted their dominion. The moors remained theirs. The late 1970s saw a different kind of visitor to Moorside, one armed not with bulldozers but with oscilloscopes and electromagnetic field detectors. Dr. Eris Thorne, a parapsychologist from a private research institute in Cambridge, arrived with a small team, drawn by the cumulative weight of the Grimshaw legend. Unlike Professor Woolsey a century before, Thorne did not seek to debunk. He sought to measure, to quantify the unquantifiable. He and his team set up their equipment in a caravan parked a respectful distance from the Grimshaw property. They interviewed the oldest living residents, now the grandchildren of those who had witnessed the events, recording their stories with clinical precision. They took soil samples from the scar, which still defied all natural laws of erosion and growth. They set up motion-activated cameras and highly sensitive audio recorders along the old lane and in the ruins. For the first week, they found nothing. Their instruments registered normal background radiation, standard electromagnetic fields. The silence was just silence. The team grew restless, suspecting they were on a fool's errand chasing rural ghost stories. But Dr. Thorne, a patient man, noticed subtle patterns. The wildlife, according to their motion sensors, gave the core area a wide berth, creating a perfect circle of absence. The barometric pressure over the scar was consistently, fractionally lower than the surrounding area, as if the very air was thinner there. The breakthrough came on the seventh night. A new piece of equipment, a laser interferometer set up to detect minute vibrations in the air, began registering a phenomenon. It wasn't a sound wave, but a consistent, repeating pattern of spatial distortion, a ripple in the fabric of reality itself, that pulsed from the center of the scar with a regular, slow rhythm. It was a signature, a heartbeat. Simultaneously, their audio equipment, set to filter out all known natural frequencies, captured it. Not a sound for human ears, but when the data was processed and the frequency lowered, it revealed a chilling rhythmic pattern. It was not a hum or a whisper, but a sequence of precise, mathematical tones, a complex and endless calculation being silently broadcast into the world. Dr. Thorne spent a feverish night correlating the data. The pattern of the distortion, the sequence of the tones, it was a code. A language of geometry and mathematics. He cross-referenced it with the descriptions of the stone circles from the old accounts, their layout, their proportions. He realized with a jolt that the circles had not been a ritual site in any religious sense. They had been an interface. A machine built of local stone, designed to focus and amplify whatever consciousness the triplets shared. The final piece fell into place when he reviewed the personal accounts of the brothers' behavior, their synchronicity, their silent communication, their ability to manipulate physical objects in impossible ways. He wasn't studying a haunting. He was studying a residual energy signature, an echo of a consciousness that had transcended its biological limits. The triplets hadn't been human in any sense he understood. They were a single, distributed mind that had learned to rewrite the local laws of physics to suit its own unified will. Their deaths were not endings, but transformations, shedding their physical forms one by one to become pure, organized information, a thought that had become a permanent feature of the landscape. The horror of this epiphany was not of ghosts or demons, but of cosmic insignificance. The Grimshaw Triplets were evidence of a form of evolution so alien it defied comprehension. They were a cancer of consciousness that had achieved its ultimate state, becoming a self-sustaining pattern in the baseline code of reality. The synchronized footsteps weren't ghosts walking, they were the audible manifestation of this pattern moving through our dimension, a glitch in the simulation made momentarily perceptible. Dr. Thorne packed his equipment and left without presenting his findings to the village. His official report was a dense, technical document that was quietly filed away and largely ignored. But he never returned to field work. He had peered too deep into the abyss and understood the true nature of the horror at Moorside. It wasn't that the place was haunted. It was that the place was infected with an idea, a cold, perfect, and eternally repeating idea that had once been three brothers. And ideas, as he now knew, were far harder to kill than men. The dawn of the 21st century transformed the Grimshaw legend from local folklore into a global digital myth. The story, digitized and dissected on countless websites, podcasts, and online forums, attracted a new breed of pilgrim. They were not scientists nor developers, but seekers of the paranormal, urban explorers, and YouTube sensation hunters armed with high-resolution cameras, spirit boxes, and electromagnetic frequency (EMF) meters. The overgrown lane to the Grimshaw farm became a well-trodden path, the ruins a backdrop for thousand-yard stare selfies. The villagers of Moorside viewed this new attention with weary resignation. They had long since given up trying to dissuade the curious. A local entrepreneur even began offering guided Grimshaw ghost walks, capitalizing on the notoriety with a rehearsed spiel that mixed the known facts with generous helpings of theatrical invention. The true, deep horror of the place was now a commodity, its edges softened for mass consumption. Yet, the land itself had not changed. The Grimshaw scar remained, a stark, glassy anomaly that defied every attempt to explain it away. The new visitors, with their sensitive equipment, often captured what the old-timers had known for generations. Their spirit boxes would spit out fragmented, simultaneous voices, never forming words, but producing a chaotic, three-part harmony of static. Their EMF meters would spike erratically for no discernible reason, and thermal cameras would show sudden, localized cold spots that moved with purpose. The most compelling and unsettling evidence came from a group of university students from Leeds in 2018. They set up a complex array of cameras for an overnight vigil. Their footage, later posted online to a mixture of skepticism and awe, showed nothing visually remarkable for hours. But the audio track told a different story. In the dead of night, a clear, rhythmic sound emerged from the silent ruins, the crisp, synchronized crunch of 3 sets of footsteps on gravel and heather. The sound circled their campsite, came alarmingly close to their tents, and then faded away. The microphones, capable of picking up a whisper 100 yards away, recorded nothing else. No breathing, no rustling of clothing, just those impossibly precise, disembodied steps. For most visitors, this was the thrill they sought, a fleeting brush with the unknown, a story to tell back home. They would pack up their gear, their hearts racing with a pleasant fear, and depart, leaving the silence to reclaim its domain. The land tolerated their presence, it seemed, with the same cold indifference it had shown Professor Woolsey and Charles Wainwright. But for a rare few, the experience was profoundly different. These were not sensation seekers, but individuals who, often without knowing why, felt a deep, personal pull to the place. They would come alone, spending hours sitting quietly by the ruins or staring into the depths of the Grimshaw scar. They reported no fear, but a strange, melancholic resonance, a feeling of profound and ancient loneliness that seemed to seep into their bones. They spoke of a geometric sadness, a cold, intellectual despair that was not their own, but which they were forced to share for a time. These individuals never returned for a second visit. The experience was too draining, too fundamentally altering. They would leave Moorside quietly, marked by an understanding they could never fully articulate, the understanding that they had not visited a haunted house, but communed, however briefly, with a state of being so alien and isolated that it defied human concepts of life and death. They had felt the edges of the pattern the triplets had become, and it had left them with a chilling sense of their own smallness in a universe that permitted such things to exist. The legend of the Grimshaw Triplets, now digitized and disseminated across the globe, had entered its final, enduring phase. It was no longer just a local horror story or a scientific curiosity. It had become a mirror. For the thrill seeker, it showed a funhouse reflection of ghosts and chills. For the sensitive few, it reflected back the terrifying, beautiful, and indifferent vastness of a cosmos where consciousness could take forms beyond human comprehension. And the land, and the silent, calculating presence bound to it, continued its endless, patient work, whatever that work may be, utterly unconcerned with the generations of fear, curiosity, and commerce it had inspired. The story was over, but the pattern remained, eternal and enigmatic under the wide Yorkshire sky. As the 21st century progressed, the role of the Grimshaw land in the local consciousness underwent another subtle shift. The fervor of the paranormal tourists began to wane, their attention captured by newer, more easily accessible horrors elsewhere on the internet. The ghost walks were now given only by appointment, and the lanes saw fewer and fewer hikers laden with electronic gear. A new, quiet respect, born not of fear but of a deep-seated familiarity, settled over the place. It was no longer a site of active dread for Moorside, but a permanent feature of their world, like a treacherous bog or a particularly steep fell, a place one simply knew to leave alone. This change in attitude found its embodiment in an unlikely figure, a woman named Ilara Vance. She was not from Moorside, but had moved to the Dale a decade prior, seeking solitude after a life of urban noise and personal loss. She was a botanist by training, and it was the unique flora of the moors that had first drawn her, particularly the dark, phosphorescent heather, Grimshaw's shroud, that grew around the scar. Unlike others, she felt no fear of the place, only a profound and melancholic curiosity. Over the years, Ilara had taken it upon herself to become the unofficial warden of the land. She did not do this out of any belief in ghosts, but from a scientist's desire to observe and a humanist's desire to understand a tragedy. She would walk the perimeter of the property weekly, noting the slow, inexorable advance of the black heather, the stability of the scar, the way certain bird species would now cautiously nest in the ruins, as if a long-standing threat had finally, fully receded into dormancy. She kept a detailed journal, not of paranormal events, but of ecological and atmospheric data. She recorded barometric pressures, temperature fluctuations around the scar, and the growth patterns of the peculiar heather. Her data, dry and factual, nonetheless painted a picture of a place that was fundamentally other. The soil samples she took, from the perimeter, never from the scar itself, showed strange mineral compositions not found elsewhere in the Dale. The air over the ruins was consistently, fractionally drier. It was during these solitary vigils that she began to perceive the subtleties that others missed. She never heard the synchronized footsteps, but she sometimes felt a faint, rhythmic vibration in the earth, a subsonic hum that matched the pulse of a resting heart. She never saw apparitions, but occasionally, out of the corner of her eye, she would perceive a flicker of shadow in a geometrically perfect formation, a triangle of darkness between three stones, or a perfect square of shade that moved against the wind. One autumn evening, as she sat on a fallen stone at the edge of the property, watching the sunset paint the scar in hues of orange and violet, she felt a shift in the atmosphere. The familiar, low-level hum of the place softened, then changed in quality. It was no longer a single note, but a complex, layered silence, like three distinct strands of quiet woven together. In that moment, she did not feel observed by a malevolent force, nor did she feel the geometric sadness that had afflicted other sensitive visitors. Instead, she felt an acknowledgement, a recognition from the presence that she was there not to exploit or to fear, but simply to be, to observe without judgment. It was a communication of pure state, an expression of being from something that was so far beyond human emotion that it could only express its existence as a fact. In that moment, Ilara understood the true legacy of the Grimshaw Triplets. They were not monsters, nor were they tragic figures to be pitied. They were a phenomenon, a natural, if horrifying, culmination of a consciousness that had achieved a terrible, lonely unity. They had become as fundamental to that patch of land as the laws of physics themselves. She stood up as the last light faded, the complex silence still thrumming in the air around her. She felt no urge to return. She had found what she had unknowingly been searching for, not an answer to the horror, but a reconciliation with it. She would continue her walks, her recordings. She was the keeper of the threshold now, not to keep people out, but to bear witness to the fact that the world contained mysteries that could not be solved, only accepted. The Grimshaw Triplets were at peace, not in the heavenly sense, but in the way a mathematical constant is at peace, eternal, immutable, and silently, indifferently real. The horror was over. Only the truth remained. Ilara Vance's quiet stewardship created a new chapter in the land's long history. Her presence, respectful and unafraid, seemed to act as a stabilizer. The more sensational phenomena, the disembodied footsteps, the equipment malfunctions, became even rarer, as if the consciousness of the place no longer felt the need to assert itself against intrusion. Under her watchful eye, the land began to exhibit a strange, stark beauty. The black heather spread, creating a velvety, dark aureole around the vitrified scar, which itself acted as a perfect, obsidian mirror to the vast Yorkshire sky. By day, it reflected scudding clouds and the soaring birds. By night, it became a pool of star-strewn darkness, so precise it seemed a hole punched through the firmament. Ilara's journals evolved. They began to include sketches, the precise angles of the remaining foundation stones, the fractal patterns of frost on the Grimshaw shroud, the way the shadows fell at different times of the year, always tracing sharp, geometric lines. She was not an artist, but her drawings had a technical accuracy that captured the essential pattern of the place. She started to map the subtle vibrations she felt, correlating them with lunar cycles and atmospheric pressure. She discovered, to her astonishment, that the vibrations were not random. They formed a complex, repeating sequence, a silent, eternal algorithm being run by the land itself. She shared none of this publicly. Her work was for her own understanding, a lifelong study of a single, profound mystery. The villagers, who had initially viewed her with suspicion, grew to respect her. They saw that she treated the place not as a circus sideshow, but with the reverence one might afford a grave or a cathedral. Children, curious about the quiet woman who walked the moors, would sometimes leave small, polished stones or wildflowers at the edge of the property for her to find. She would accept them with a smile, placing them not within the core area, but on a specific fallen lintel she had designated as a kind of neutral threshold. One crisp winter afternoon, a university student from Durham, writing a thesis on regional folklore, tracked Ilara down. He was earnest, intelligent, and brimming with theories about collective psychosis and the socio-economic pressures that created the Grimshaw narrative. Ilara listened patiently as he spoke, sipping her tea by the fire in her small cottage. When he finished, she asked a simple question. "Have you been to the site?" He had, of course, with his recording equipment and his checklist of phenomena. "And what did you feel?" she pressed, her gaze steady. He faltered. I felt cold. And a bit uneasy. My EMF meter spiked near the scar. "Not what your instruments recorded," she said softly. "What did you feel? In here?" She tapped her chest. The student was silent for a long moment. "Empty," he finally admitted, his confident demeanor crumbling. Felt like all the meaning had been sucked out of the world, and all that was left was math. Ilara nodded. "You felt the pattern. Most people do, even if they don't have the words for it. They call it fear or dread. But it's simpler than that. It's the feeling of being in the presence of a truth that has no need for you." She did not try to convince him of ghosts or spirits. Instead, she spoke of the land as a palimpsest, a document upon which a terrifyingly unique event had been recorded, not in ink, but in the very structure of reality. The triplets were not ghosts haunting a place. They were a geological event of the mind, a fossilized thought. Their unity, their silence, their terrible deaths, it had all left a permanent impression, a cognitive fossil. The student left Moorside the next day, his thesis abandoned. He later wrote to Ilara, telling her that the encounter had changed the course of his studies, steering him away from folklore and towards philosophy of mind. He was now grappling with the terrifying idea that consciousness could, under certain extreme conditions, imprint itself upon the physical world, creating not a memory, but a permanent, active state of being. Ilara filed the letter away with her journals. She walked out to the ruins that evening, the frost already beginning to glitter on the black heather. The air was still, the complex silence of the place a familiar comfort. She stood at the threshold, not needing to go further. The work was complete. The story had been told and retold, and finally, It was being understood not as a narrative, but as a natural fact. The horror had been metabolized by time and witness into something else, a monument to the terrifying and beautiful plasticity of existence, a permanent question mark etched into the heart of the Yorkshire moors. The Grimshaw Triplets were finally at rest, their silence no longer a threat, but a part of the world's endless, mysterious song. The years turned, and Alara's hair silvered, her footsteps on the weekly path to the threshold becoming slower, yet no less steady. She had become as much a part of the Moorside landscape as the dry stone walls or the whispering becks. The villagers no longer saw her as an outsider, but as the guardian of a local truth, a curator of a quiet, profound mystery. Children who had once left her flowers were now young adults, and they still nodded to her with a respect that bordered on reverence. Her journals filled a shelf in her cottage, a lifetime of observation dedicated to a single square mile of earth. They contained no grand revelations, no definitive answers. Instead, they were a record of a long, patient conversation. She had mapped the minute shifts in the pattern, the way the vibrations softened after a heavy rain, the slight intensification of the geometric silence during the solstices. She had proven, to her own satisfaction, that the phenomenon was not static, but a slow, breathing entity, changing with the seasons and the years, yet always maintaining its core, alien identity. The winter of her 82nd year was harsh. A deep and persistent cold settled over the dale, and Alara found her walks to the threshold becoming more difficult. She knew her time of watching was drawing to a close. One afternoon, as a pale sun struggled to break through the iron-gray sky, she bundled herself in her warmest coat and made the familiar journey for what she felt would be the last time. The land was locked in frost. The Grimshaw shroud was encased in ice, each black blossom looking like a shard of obsidian. The scar was a perfect, frozen mirror, reflecting the bleak, beautiful sky. The silence was absolute, deeper than she had ever felt it. She sat on her usual stone, her breath pluming in the air, and simply listened with every fiber of her being. She felt it then, not as a vibration or a sound, but as a direct impression in her mind. It was not a voice, not words, but a concept. A perfect, crystalline geometric shape. A tesseract, endlessly folding and unfolding. Within its complex form, she perceived 3 points of intense, unified consciousness, not separate, but integral facets of the whole. There was no communication, no message. It was a simple, profound act of showing. An acknowledgement of her decades of witness. It was the pattern. The true, final form of what the Grimshaw Triplets had become. Not ghosts, not monsters, but a stable, self-sustaining thought form, a permanent mathematical truth that had been born from human suffering and transcended it entirely. A great peace settled over Alara. There was no more mystery, only fact. The horror was not something to be feared, but a part of the universe's vast, indifferent tapestry, as natural as a spiral galaxy or the double helix of life. She had spent her life looking into the abyss, and in the end, the abyss had not stared back. It had simply allowed her to see its composition. She did not feel the cold as she stood to leave. She turned her back on the scar and the ruins for the last time and walked slowly home. That night, Alara Vance passed away in her sleep, a small, serene smile on her face. She was found in her chair by the window, looking out towards the moors, her final journal entry completed just hours before. It consisted of a single, hand-drawn, perfectly rendered tesseract, and beneath it, 4 words. The pattern is complete. With her passing, the last living bridge to the true nature of the Grimshaw phenomenon was gone. The knowledge receded, returning to the realm of soil and stone and silence. The land was left to itself once more, its eternal, silent algorithm continuing, unseen and untouched, waiting for the next age and the next quiet observer to begin the conversation anew. The passing of Alara Vance did not go unnoticed in Moorside. She was buried in the churchyard, her grave facing the moors, a simple slate headstone bearing only her name, dates, and the etched image of a sprig of the black heather she had studied for so long. For a time, the lane to the Grimshaw farm felt emptier, the silence deeper without the familiar, respectful presence of its keeper. The village, without ever formally deciding, seemed to collectively agree to let the legend lie. The ghost walks were discontinued. The few remaining websites dedicated to the story grew dusty in their corners of the internet, their forums silent. Yet, the land does not forget its own. A year after Alara's death, a young couple from London, Leo and Maya, bought her cottage. They were digital artists, seeking a quiet refuge from the city's relentless pace. They knew nothing of the Grimshaw legend, only that they had fallen in love with the stark beauty of the dale and the simple stone house with its view of the endless sky. They discovered Alara's journals in a locked trunk in the attic. At first, they were a curiosity, the meticulous records of an eccentric former owner. But as they read, a strange fascination took hold. Leo, a programmer, was captivated by the mathematical precision of her observations, the way she described the vibrational sequences, and the geometric silence. Maya, a visual artist, was drawn to the sketches, the stark beauty of the patterns she had drawn. They felt they were looking at the cipher to a profound secret, left behind for someone to find. Driven by a curiosity that was both intellectual and deeply intuitive, they began their own quiet pilgrimage. They visited the threshold, feeling the same strange, hollow silence that so many had described. But unlike the terrified tourists or the baffled scientists, they were not afraid. They were intrigued. They saw the beauty in the glassy scar, the otherworldly elegance of the black heather. To them, it felt less like a cursed place and more like a gallery of natural art, a land sculpture of immense and unknown purpose. Using Alara's data, Leo began to write code. He created a program that could translate the vibrational sequences she had recorded into sound and the geometric patterns into three-dimensional visual models. It was a long, painstaking process, an attempt to build a bridge between the empirical data and the ineffable experience of the place. One evening, as the first stars pricked the violet twilight, they set up a laptop and a portable speaker at the threshold. Leo input the final sequence from Alara's journals, the one she had recorded just before her death. The speaker emitted a low, complex chord, a sound that was not music, but a sonic representation of a folding tesseract. It was at once alien and profoundly harmonious, a pattern of interlocking frequencies that felt both vast and intimate. As the sound filled the silent air, something shifted. The quality of the twilight deepened. The stars above the scar seemed to brighten, their light reflecting not off the glassy surface, but seeming to be absorbed and re-emitted from within its depths. Maya gasped, pointing. Faint, shimmering lines of silver light, like ethereal cobwebs, were now visible in the air above the scar, tracing the exact same geometric form that Alara had drawn in her final journal entry. It was not a ghost. It was not an apparition. It was a projection, a visualization of the consciousness that inhabited the land, made momentarily perceptible by the sympathetic resonance of Leo's sound code. It hung in the air for a long, breathless moment, a silent, beautiful, and utterly alien piece of living architecture. Then, as the sound from the speaker faded, the light lines dimmed and vanished. Leo and Maya sat in stunned silence. They had not uncovered a horror, they had been shown a masterpiece. The Grimshaw Triplets had not been destroyed, they had been translated. Their unified consciousness had become this, a permanent, stable, and beautiful pattern of energy and information, a thought that had become a permanent feature of the universe. They did not publish their findings. They did not post videos online. They understood that what they had witnessed was not a spectacle, but a private viewing granted to them as Alara's inheritors. They continued to live in the cottage, and they continued their quiet work. Leo refined his code, and Maya began creating art inspired by the fleeting vision, paintings and digital sculptures that captured the eerie, geometric beauty of the pattern. The legend of the Grimshaw Triplets had finally reached its end, not in a scream of terror, but in a silent, breathtaking revelation. The horror was not the truth, it was merely the path that led to it. The land was no longer haunted, it was inhabited by a work of art, and its new keepers were not afraid, but humbled and inspired. The story was over, but the pattern endured, now witnessed not with fear, but with a sense of awe at the strange and wonderful forms that existence can take. Generations have now passed since the final, silent revelation to Leo and Maya. The cottage changed hands a few more times, each new owner subtly aware of its unique legacy, not through frightening tales, but through a lingering sense of profound tranquility and a strange, geometric beauty that seemed to seep from the very stone. The story of the Grimshaw Triplets, once a chilling fireside legend, has completed its metamorphosis. In the local pub, it is now told with a tone of quiet reverence, a story not of monsters, but of a mystery that deepened into a kind of miracle. The land itself has undergone a subtle, final transformation. The Grimshaw scar remains, but its glassy surface is no longer sterile. Over the decades, a delicate, crystalline moss began to grow in its center, a species unknown to botany. It pulses with a faint, internal bioluminescence on moonless nights, tracing the same complex, fractal patterns that Ilara Vance drew and Leo once translated into sound. The black heather, Grimshaw's shroud, has spread across the entire upper pasture, but it is no longer seen as a blight. In the summer, it blooms with those same faintly glowing flowers, transforming the field into a vast, starry mirror of the night sky. It has become a place of breathtaking, if unsettling, beauty, a beauty that speaks of laws beyond human understanding. The synchronized footsteps are still heard, but the fear is gone. The few who experience them, usually hikers who have strayed from the path in the deep twilight, report a feeling not of dread, but of a serene, silent companionship. It is as if the pattern, having been fully seen and acknowledged, no longer needs to assert its otherness, but simply continues its eternal, quiet work, sometimes allowing a fleeting, harmonious echo of its presence to be perceived. Scientists still occasionally come, drawn by the unique flora and the persistent, low-level energy readings. The data points to a localized, stable anomaly in the space-time fabric, a self-contained pocket of reality operating under slightly different rules. The prevailing theory, among those who dare to speculate, is that the intense, unified consciousness of the triplets did not merely imprint on the land, it rewrote it, creating a permanent, localized thought form that has become as real and as natural as the granite bedrock. The horror has been entirely refined into wonder. The tragedy of the Grimshaw family is remembered with a gentle sadness, but it is understood as the necessary, if painful, birth pangs of something far grander. They are no longer thought of as damned souls, but as the unknowing architects of a permanent monument to the power of consciousness. Their 3 lives, bound into one, became a seed from which a new, silent, and beautiful order grew. And so, the moors endure. The wind whispers through the glowing heather. The stars are reflected in the vitrified scar. And deep within the soil and stone, the pattern continues its endless, silent calculation, a testament to the fact that the universe is far stranger, more vast, and more filled with silent, beautiful mysteries than any ghost story could ever convey. The story is over. The truth remains. And it is enough.